His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Thomas Crawford stared at the letter for the third time that morning, trying to make sense of the knot in his chest. 3 words kept jumping out at him from the careful handwriting. I ain't pretty. The stagecoach would roll into town in less than an hour, bringing with it a woman he'd never laid eyes on. A woman who'd be his wife by week's end if he didn't turn her away. Thomas set the letter down on the kitchen table and walked to the window, looking out over the Wyoming ranch land that stretched toward the mountains. 8 years he'd live alone in this house. 8 years since Margaret died, bringing their stillborn son into the world. 8 years of silence, so thick it pressed against his ears like cotton. He was 42 years old and felt every day of it in his bones. The ranch was doing well. Cattle prices were up, the grass was good, and he had reliable hands working for him. But prosperity meant nothing when you ate every meal alone and went to bed in a house that echoed with emptiness. His sister Emily had been the one to finally break through his stubborn isolation. She'd practically forced him to place the advertisement in the Missouri newspaper. You're dying by inches, Thomas, she'd said, and I won't watch it anymore. The advertisement had been simple. Renchore, widower, seeking honest woman for marriage. Must be of good character and willing to work. Wyoming territory. He hadn't expected much response. Who wanted to come out to the middle of nowhere to marry a man they'd never met? But the letters had come. A dozen of them. Most he'd thrown away after reading the first few lines. Women wanting to know how much land he owned, how much money he had, whether he'd buy them dresses from San Francisco. Then came Sarah Mae Jenkins's letter. It was different from the start. No questions about money or land. Instead, she'd written about the garden she kept behind the boarding house where she worked. She'd told him about a bird that nested in the eaves every spring and how she left out seeds for it. She'd asked him if Wyoming had fireflies because she missed them from her childhood. Small things, real things, things that made him smile for the first time in longer than he could remember. They'd exchanged 6 letters over 3 months. With each one, Thomas found himself checking the mail more eagerly. Sarah wrote like she talked, he imagined, direct and honest, with a dry humor that caught him off guard. She'd asked him real questions. What did he regret most in his life? What made him laugh? If he could go back and change one thing, what would it be? And she'd answered the same questions about herself. She told him about losing her parents young, about working since she was 14, about the loneliness of watching other people's lives while feeling invisible in her own. Thomas had found himself being more honest in those letters than he'd been with anyone, even Margaret. He'd written about his failures as a husband, about how he'd been so focused on building the ranch that he'd forgotten to build a marriage, about how Margaret had been beautiful and kind, and how he'd somehow managed to make her lonely even when they were in the same room. He'd promised himself that if he ever got another chance, he'd do better. He'd be better. But now this letter, it had arrived yesterday, and it had kept him up all night. Sarah's handwriting had been shakier than usual, as if her hand had trembled while she wrote. Mr. Crawford, it began formal after months of using his first name. I need to tell you something before I arrive, and you have every right to send me back on the next stage if you choose. I ain't pretty, sir. I'm plain as a fence post, and that's being generous. I'm 34 years old with brown hair that won't hold a curl and a face that's easy to forget. I know you never asked what I looked like, and I appreciated that more than you know, but it wouldn't be right to let you think you're getting something you're not. Thomas had read those words over and over, feeling something twist in his gut. But it was what came next that had really struck him. I'm telling you this now, so I won't have to see disappointment in your eyes when I step off that coach. You seem like a good man, Mr. Crawford, and I'd rather remember you from your letters than see you try to hide what you're feeling. But I need you to know something else too. I can cook, sir. I can cook better than anyone you've ever met. And I know what it means to be invisible. I know what it means to be the person nobody notices. Maybe that's what you need. Someone who won't expect much. Someone who'll be grateful for whatever kindness you can spare. The letter had ended simply. I'll be on the Thursday stage. If you're not there to meet me, I'll understand. Sarah Mae Jenkins. Thomas picked up the letter again, running his thumb over her signature. His first reaction had surprised him. He felt disappointed, yes, but not because she wasn't pretty. He was disappointed because she thought it mattered, because someone had made her feel like her only value was being useful, being invisible, being grateful for scraps. And he was disappointed in himself for placing an advertisement that made her think he was looking for a transaction instead of a person. The truth that had kept him awake was simpler and more complicated than appearance. He'd been looking forward to meeting her. Not the idea of her, not just a wife, but Sarah. The woman who wrote about fireflies and asked him about regrets. The woman whose letters had made him feel less alone for the first time since Margaret died. And now she was coming here, believing she had to apologize for her face. Thomas. Emily's voice came from the doorway. His sister had arrived early, as she'd promised, to help him meet his bride. She was 50 years old, sturdy and practical, with gray streaking through her brown hair. She'd been widowed herself 10 years back and had no patience for foolishness. You ready? I don't know what I am, Thomas admitted. He handed her the letter. Emily read it quickly, her lips pressing into a thin line. Lord have mercy, she said quietly. Someone hurt this girl bad. I know. You thinking of turning her away? Thomas looked at his sister. Are you out of your mind? Why would I do that? Emily's expression softened. Good, because if you did, I'd have to knock sense into you. Come on, stage will be here in 30 minutes. She paused at the door. Thomas, just so you know, Margaret was beautiful, and you failed her anyway. So maybe try seeing if someone's heart is pretty instead of their face. The words stung because they were true. Thomas grabbed his hat and followed his sister out to the wagon. The ride into town took 20 minutes, and he spent every one of them trying to figure out what he'd say. How did you tell someone that you weren't disappointed when they'd spent a lifetime learning to expect nothing else? The town of Clearwater wasn't much. A main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other buildings. The stagecoach stop was in front of the hotel, and there was already a small crowd gathering. News traveled fast in a small town, and everyone knew Thomas Crawford was collecting his mail-order bride today. The stage rolled in right on time, dust billowing up from the wheels. Thomas's heart was hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. The driver climbed down and opened the door. A businessman stepped out first, then an older woman, then a young cowboy. Thomas was starting to think Sarah had changed her mind when one more passenger appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment, and Thomas got his first look at Sarah Mae Jenkins. She was exactly as she described herself. Brown hair pulled back in a simple bun, average height, wearing a plain gray traveling dress that had seen better days. Her face was ordinary in every conventional sense, but it was her eyes that caught him. Brown eyes that were intelligent and wary and kind all at once. Eyes that had seen disappointment before and were bracing for it again. She climbed down from the stage carefully, clutching a worn carpet bag in one hand and a large covered basket in the other. She looked around the small crowd until her gaze landed on him. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Thomas saw her shoulders straighten, saw her chin lift slightly, like she was preparing for battle. She walked toward him slowly, stopping a few feet away. You're Thomas Crawford? Her voice was quiet but steady. Yes, ma'am. I'm Sarah Jenkins. She paused, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed. The letter I sent, it wasn't to give you warning so you could refuse me. It was so I wouldn't have to see disappointment in your eyes when I got here. She met his gaze directly. Thank you for not showing it. Even if you feel it. Thomas felt every eye in town on them. He knew this moment mattered. He knew that whatever he said next would set the tone for everything that came after. He thought about all the things he could say, all the polite reassurances. But Sarah had been honest with him. She deserved honesty back. Ma'am, he said clearly, I've been disappointed many times in my life. I've been disappointed in myself more than anyone. But I'm not disappointed today. He gestured to the wagon where Emily waited. I'm glad you came. Real glad. Now let's get you home. Sarah didn't speak much on the ride to the ranch. She sat beside Emily in the back of the wagon, her basket balanced carefully on her lap while Thomas drove. Emily tried to make conversation, asking about the journey and the weather back in Missouri, but Sarah's answers were brief and polite. Thomas understood. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for him to change his mind. The ranch came into view as they crested the last hill. The house was a solid two-story structure with a wide porch, weathered but well-maintained. The barn and outbuildings were in good repair, and cattle dotted the pastures stretching toward the mountains. It was a good property, and Thomas had worked hard to build it. But he saw it now through Sarah's eyes and wondered what she thought. It's bigger than I expected, Sarah said quietly. It was the first thing she'd said without being asked. Been here 15 years, Thomas replied. Built most of it myself, with help from the hands. When they pulled up to the house, Jake, the ranch foreman, came out to help with the luggage. He was a grizzled man in his 50s who'd been with Thomas since the beginning. He tipped his hat to Sarah. "Ma'am, welcome." "Thank you," Sarah said. She clutched her basket tighter. Emily showed Sarah inside, while Thomas and Jake brought in her single carpet bag. The house was cleaned but sparse. Thomas had never been one for decoration, and after Margaret died, he'd seen no point in it. The furniture was practical and sturdy. The rooms felt empty despite being lived in. Sarah stood in the main room, taking it all in. Thomas watched her carefully, trying to read her expression. She wasn't judging, he realized. She was calculating, figuring out what needed doing, where things should go, how to make this house work. "I'd like to start supper, if that's all right," Sarah said suddenly. "It's been a long day, and I imagine everyone's hungry." "You don't need to cook tonight," Emily said kindly. "You just got here. I brought a stew we can heat up. I prefer to cook." Sarah's voice was firm, but not unkind. "I like to earn my keep from the start." Thomas saw Emily open her mouth to argue, then close it. He understood what Sarah was doing. She was establishing her value immediately, showing them why they should keep her. It made his chest ache. "The kitchen's through here," he said, leading the way. Sarah set her mysterious basket on the counter and looked around. The kitchen was functional but basic. A cast iron stove, a pump for water, shelves with minimal supplies. She opened the pantry and Thomas saw her mentally cataloging what was there. Flour, beans, some dried meat, basic staples. The kitchen of a man who cooked to survive, not to enjoy. "This'll do," Sarah said. She turned to Thomas. "How many for supper?" "Just the three of us tonight. The hands eat in the bunkhouse." Sarah nodded and started unpacking her basket. Thomas watched in fascination as she pulled out items he'd never seen before. Small cloth bags of spices, a jar of something dark and aromatic, dried herbs he couldn't identify. She worked quickly and efficiently, her earlier nervousness vanishing as she moved through the familiar routine. "Where did you get all that?" Emily asked, curious. "Collected them over the years. Grew some, traded for others." Sarah was already mixing something in a bowl, her hands moving with practiced confidence. A good cook needs more than salt and pepper. Thomas and Emily retreated to the main room, leaving Sarah to work. An hour later, she called them to the table. Thomas sat down and stared at the plate she set in front of him. It wasn't the simple fare he'd expected. The meat was tender and covered in a rich sauce that smelled like nothing he'd ever encountered. The vegetables were seasoned with something that made his mouth water. There was fresh bread somehow, despite her just arriving. He took a bite and stopped. Just stopped. It wasn't just good. It was extraordinary. The flavors were complex and layered, each one distinct but working together. He looked up at Sarah, who was watching him with those careful, guarded eyes. Emily had taken a bite too. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. Jake had come to the kitchen door to ask about tomorrow's work and froze when he smelled the food. "Ma'am," he said to Sarah, "I don't mean to be forward, but I'd ride through a blizzard for another plate of that." The tiniest smile touched Sarah's lips. It was the first time Thomas had seen her smile, and it transformed her face. Not into conventional beauty, but into something warm and real. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Thomas asked. The smile faded. Sarah looked down at her plate. "When you're plain, you learn other ways to make people happy. Food makes everyone happy if it's done right. But where?" Emily pressed. "This isn't ordinary cooking, Sarah. This is something special." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I was a cook in a fine house once, in St. Louis. Before," she trailed off, her hands gripping her fork tightly. "Before things changed." Thomas wanted to ask more, but something in her expression stopped him. There was pain there, old and deep. Whatever had happened in St. Louis, it was part of why she'd answered his advertisement, part of why she believed herself invisible. They ate in silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people enjoying something too good to interrupt with talk. When they finished, Sarah started to clear the plates, but Emily stopped her. "You cooked. I'll clean. That's the rule in this house now." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but finally nodded. She excused herself to the small room off the kitchen that would be hers until the wedding. Thomas and Emily cleaned up together, not speaking until Sarah's door closed. "That girl's got secrets," Emily said quietly. And wounds. Deep ones. I know. You still want to marry her? Thomas thought about the letters, about the woman who wrote of fireflies and loneliness. He thought about the way she'd smiled when Jake praised her cooking, like she was starving for any scrap of appreciation. He thought about someone making her believe her only value was in being useful and invisible. More than before, he said. That night, Thomas lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Down the hall, Sarah was in her room, probably wondering if she'd done enough to be allowed to stay. In the kitchen, the lingering smell of her cooking still hung in the air. His house, empty for so long, suddenly felt like it had something in it besides furniture and memories. He told her the truth at the stagecoach. He wasn't disappointed, but now he realized something that surprised him. He was hopeful. For the first time in 8 years, Thomas Crawford was actually hopeful about the future, and it scared him half to death. The first 3 weeks passed in a careful dance. Sarah transformed the house, not with decoration, but with life. The kitchen became the heart of everything. Ranch hands who used to eat quickly in the bunkhouse now found reasons to linger near the main house around mealtimes. The smell of bread baking or stew simmering drew them like moths to a flame. Thomas watched Sarah work and started noticing things. The way she hummed softly when she thought no one was listening. How she saved scraps for the barn cats and left out water for the birds. The small herb garden she'd started beside the kitchen door, nursing tiny plants with the same care most people reserve for children. She was making the ranch into a home, and she was doing it so quietly that you almost didn't notice until it was done. They talked more now, in the evenings after supper. Nothing deep, just the small exchanges of daily life. How the cattle were doing, whether they needed supplies from town, what the weather might bring. But sometimes in those conversations, Thomas caught glimpses of something more. Sarah would mention a book she'd read, and her whole face would light up. Or she'd tell a story from her childhood, and he'd hear the girl she'd been before life had taught her to make herself small. He tried to show her he was paying attention. When she mentioned missing the sound of rain on a tin roof, he made sure to leave the kitchen window open during the next storm. When she said she'd always want to see the mountains up close, he offered to take her riding. Small things. But he saw her notice each one, saw the surprise in her eyes like she couldn't quite believe someone was listening. The first Sunday, they went to church together. It was expected, and Thomas knew the whole town would be watching. Sarah wore her best dress, which wasn't much better than her traveling clothes, and kept her eyes down as they walked in. The other women looked her over with barely concealed judgment. Thomas heard the whispers. Plain little thing, isn't she? Well, beggars can't be choosers. At least she looks like she can work. But after the service, there was a social. Sarah had brought food, of course. Roasted chicken with herbs, fresh rolls, and a berry pie that made people stop talking when they tasted it. The men crowded around, praising the food loudly. Their wives smiled tightly and said it was nice enough. Thomas saw Sarah's face stay carefully blank, but her hands trembled slightly as she served. It was when they were loading the wagon that Thomas heard it. 2 women standing close enough to be overheard, probably on purpose. That plain woman Crawford settled for, one said. Though I suppose when you're desperate, you take what you can get. The other laughed. At least she's useful. That's something. Thomas saw Sarah's back stiffen. She didn't turn around, just kept loading the basket into the wagon with mechanical precision. He opened his mouth to say something, to defend her, but the moment passed. The women walked away, and Thomas hated himself for his silence. On the ride home, Sarah was quiet. Too quiet. That night, she was polite but distant. And the next day, and the next. The ease they'd been building disappeared behind a wall of formal politeness. Yes, Mr. Crawford. Of course, Mr. Crawford. Whatever you think best, Mr. Crawford. Emily noticed immediately. She cornered Thomas in the barn 3 days later. What did you do? Nothing. That's the problem. Then fix it. I don't know how, Thomas admitted. The words felt like failure. I don't know how to tell her that those women are wrong without making it worse. I don't know how to make her believe she matters. Emily's expression softened. You're doing it again, Thomas. You're staying silent when you should speak. That's what killed your first marriage. Don't let it kill this one before it even starts. But before Thomas could figure out what to say, everything changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon when a fancy carriage rolled up to the ranch. Thomas was in the barn and didn't see who it was until he heard Sarah's gasp from the kitchen garden. A well-dressed woman had stepped down from the carriage, staring at Sarah with wide eyes. Sarah Jenkins? Is that really you? Sarah had gone white as milk. She dropped the herbs she'd been picking. Mrs. Aldrich, I can't believe it. After all this time, Richard said you disappeared completely. The woman moved closer, and Thomas saw she wasn't being friendly. There was something cruel in her smile. So this is where you ended up, a ranch wife in the middle of nowhere. Thomas walked over, his instincts telling him something was very wrong. Ma'am, can I help you? Oh, you must be the husband. How delightful. Mrs. Aldrich looked between them with open amusement. Has she told you about St. Louis, Mr. Crawford? Thomas Crawford. Has she told you about my nephew Richard? About their little romance? The word dripped with disdain. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Please don't. But Mrs. Aldrich continued like Sarah hadn't spoken. My nephew, foolish boy, thought himself in love with the help. Can you imagine? He actually proposed marriage to our cook. She laughed. Of course, we couldn't allow such nonsense. A woman like that, thinking she could marry into our family. We had to make him see sense. Thomas felt his jaw clench. Emily had come out of the house, and Jake had stopped working, both of them listening. They were quite creative about it, I must say, Mrs. Aldrich went on. Made it clear what happens when people forget their place. And Sarah learned her lesson, didn't you, dear? Learned that women like you were meant to serve, not to be wives. Not real wives, anyway. Sarah's hands were shaking. She looked at Thomas, and he saw everything in that look. The fear that he'd see her the way these people had. The certainty that she wasn't good enough. The old wounds bleeding fresh. That's enough. Thomas's voice came out harder than he'd intended. You need to leave. Now. Mrs. Aldrich raised an eyebrow. I was simply being honest. Surely you deserve to know what kind of woman you've married. I know exactly what kind of woman I've married, Thomas said. Now get off my land. The woman sniffed, climbed back into her carriage, and left in a cloud of dust. The silence she left behind was deafening. Sarah stood frozen for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice empty. I should have told you before. I'm sorry. Sarah, I was a cook for the Aldrich family in St. Louis. Their son Richard, he was kind to me, made me feel like I mattered, said he loved me. She laughed bitterly. I was stupid enough to believe him. When he proposed, his family was horrified. They couldn't have their precious son marrying the help. She looked at Thomas directly now, tears streaming down her face. They made sure I understood my place, Mr. Crawford. Made sure I knew that women like me don't get fairy tale endings. We get what we deserve, which is nothing. Her voice broke. I learned my place, and I won't forget it again. She walked past him into the house. Thomas heard her door close, and he stood there, feeling like the worst kind of failure, because once again he didn't know what to say. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Sarah's face when that woman had spoken, thinking about his own silence at the church social, thinking about how he was doing exactly what he'd done to Margaret, letting someone suffer alone because he didn't know the right words. The next 2 days were torture. Sarah was polite and efficient, but she'd retreated so far behind her walls that Thomas couldn't reach her. She cooked, cleaned, worked harder than ever, but she wouldn't meet his eyes, wouldn't talk beyond the bare necessities. It was like living with a ghost. Then the cattle sickness hit. 3 dozen head showing symptoms of something Thomas couldn't identify. He had to ride out to the far pastures, spending 3 days and nights dealing with the crisis. By the time he got it under control, he'd barely slept, barely eaten, and felt like he'd been trampled. He rode back to the ranch at 2 in the morning, so tired he could barely stay in the saddle. The house was dark except for a lamp burning in the kitchen window. When he walked in, he found Sarah sitting at the table, waiting. You didn't have to stay up, he said. I know. She gestured to the counter. There's food. Cold chicken, bread, cheese. Things you can eat while you work tomorrow. I packed it already. Thomas looked and saw she'd prepared enough food for days. His work clothes were laid out, clean and mended. In his saddlebag by the door, he could see she'd tucked something inside. What's that? Just notes. Things to remind you to eat, to rest when you can. Her voice was flat, mechanical. I know you forget when you're busy. Something in Thomas broke. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was 3 days of thinking about everything wrong in his life, but suddenly he couldn't hold it in anymore. Sarah, I can't do this. She stood up quickly, her face going pale. I understand. I'll pack my things. No. He moved toward her. That's not what I meant. I can't do this dance where we pretend everything's fine when it's not. I can't watch you make yourself invisible because you think that's what I want. It's what everyone wants, she said quietly. It's not what I want. Thomas sat down heavily in a chair. Sarah, I don't know how to do this. My first wife was beautiful, and I failed her completely. I was so scared of feeling anything that I felt nothing. She was lonely in a house with a husband, and I let it happen. Sarah was staring at him now, really looking at him. When you wrote those letters, Thomas continued, about fireflies and gardens and being lonely, I laughed for the first time in 8 years. I looked forward to checking the mail like a kid at Christmas. And when you got here, I wasn't disappointed because you aren't pretty by some stupid standard. I was disappointed because you thought it mattered to me. How could it not matter? Sarah's voice broke. It matters to everyone. Not to me. Not about you. Thomas rubbed his face. But I'm doing the same thing I did before. Staying quiet when I should speak. At that church social, when those women said those things, I should have said something. I should have told them they were wrong. I should have told you that you matter. I'm used to it, Sarah whispered. You shouldn't have to be used to it. He looked at her directly. Sarah, do you know what I see when I look at you? I see the woman who leaves seeds out for birds. Who started a garden her first week here because growing things makes you happy. Who stays up at 2 in the morning to make sure a tired man has food for tomorrow. I see someone who makes this house feel like a home instead of a tomb. Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now. You don't have to be kind. I'm not being kind. I'm being honest. Thomas stood up. I know we're already married on paper, but I'd like to court you properly if you'll let me. I want to start over. I want to prove to you that I see you. Really see you. I don't know if I can believe that, Sarah said, but her voice held something it hadn't before. Hope. Then let me show you. Thomas took a step closer. Let me prove it. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. What else do you remember? From my letters. The question caught him off guard. What? You said my letters made you laugh. What do you remember from them? Thomas thought about the stack of letters he'd kept in his desk drawer, the ones he'd read and reread. You wrote about missing fireflies, about how your mother used to make apple butter every fall and the whole house would smell like cinnamon. You said your favorite color was green because it meant things were growing. You asked me if I believed people got second chances because you hoped they did. Sarah's breath hitched. You remember all that? I remember everything, Thomas said. You wrote that you dreamed of having your own restaurant someday, that you wanted to cook food that made people happy, not just fed them. You asked me what I regretted most, and I told you about failing Margaret. You didn't judge me for it. You just said that knowing you failed meant you could do better next time. I can't believe you remember, Sarah whispered. How could I forget? Those letters were the best part of my day for months. Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to move away. When she didn't, he took her hand. Sarah, I'm not good with words. I'm going to mess this up 100 times. But I'm asking you to give me a chance. Let me court you properly. Let me show you that I see you. Sarah looked down at their joined hands. I'm scared. Of what? Of believing you. Of hoping. Every time I've hoped for something, it got taken away. She looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. What if this is just another mistake? Then we'll make it together, Thomas said. But Sarah, I don't think this is a mistake. I think maybe this is the first thing I've gotten right in a very long time. They stood there in the lamplight, the exhausted rancher and the woman who thought she was invisible. Outside, the first hints of dawn were touching the mountains. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Sarah Mae Jenkins let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, someone actually saw her. Okay, she whispered. Okay, we could try. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. That's all I'm asking for. A chance to try. Thomas courted her properly after that night. Asked about her day, her thoughts, her dreams. Reread all her letters and asked follow-up questions that made her blush. Small gestures, wildflowers on her pillow, her favorite tea ordered from town, fixing the squeaky kitchen door she'd mentioned once in passing. Sarah slowly opened up, like morning glories facing sun. One evening, washing dishes side by side, she whispered, I always dreamed of having my own restaurant. Thomas dried a plate carefully. Why not here? Why not now? Who'd come eat food cooked by a plain woman? He set down the plate. Everyone who already finds excuses to come here. Sarah, half the town's been angling for dinner invitations since your first week. The idea took root. Sarah decided to host a harvest dinner for the entire town. Free meal in the square. Thomas supported her fully, helping prepare tables, spreading word. It was a risk, exposing herself to judgment again. The evening arrived cool and golden. Town turned out, skeptical but hungry. Sarah's cooking spoke for itself. Herb-roasted chicken, butter rolls, apple tarts that melted on tongues. People began seeing her differently, not because she'd changed physically, but because they were finally paying attention. The local preacher stood, tapping his glass. His blessing became a sermon. Seeing as God sees, not by appearance, but by heart. This woman's fed us body and soul tonight. Women who'd been cold approached Sarah afterward. Awkward apologies. Some genuine. An older woman with kind eyes took her hand. Took me 40 years to believe I was beautiful, dear. Don't take 40 years. Later, after most had gone, a wealthy rancher from the neighboring county approached. Silver-haired, confident, expensive clothes. Miss Crawford, I'm Henry Sutton. I'd like to fund you opening a real restaurant. Proper building, equipment, staff. Sarah felt Thomas tense beside her. Sutton continued, you'd have full control, naturally. I just provide capital. 20% partnership. The old Sarah would have leaped. But she looked at Thomas's tight jaw, remembered Richard's opportunities, saw the test in this moment. Mr. Sutton, she said clearly, I appreciate the offer. Truly. But if I build this dream, I'll build it my own way. Slowly. Properly. Sutton raised his eyebrows, smiled slightly. Admirable. Offer stands if you change your mind. He tipped his hat and left. Thomas released a breath he'd been holding. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. Sarah turned to him. Some things are worth building together, even if it takes longer. He pulled her close, right there in the town square, and kissed her. Not tentatively this time, but with the certainty of a man who'd finally learned what mattered. Together, he murmured against her hair. Together, she agreed, finally believing it. 6 months later, a small building stood at the edge of town. Hand-painted sign above the door, Sarah's table. Thomas had named it. It perfectly captured what she did. Made space for people, fed them more than food. The restaurant exceeded every expectation. Not fancy, but warm. Gingham curtains, mismatched chairs, tables that wobbled slightly. Sarah's cooking made it irrelevant. People came from neighboring counties. The plain woman with magic hands, they called her. Sarah had transformed, not in appearance, but in presence. She carried herself differently now. Quiet confidence replacing hunched shoulders. She'd stopped apologizing for taking up space. One afternoon, a stagecoach arrived in the square. Sarah watched from her restaurant window as a young woman stepped down. Mousy brown hair, nervous hands clutching a wrinkled letter. Another mail-order bride. Sarah's chest tightened with recognition. The girl looked around, terrified, as the stagecoach driver pointed toward the hotel. She moved like someone trying to be invisible. Sarah untied her apron. Mind the counter, Thomas. I'll be back. She caught up with the girl outside the general store. Excuse me. You just arrived? The girl, startled, nodded. Up close, she looked barely 20. Eyes red from crying. I'm Sarah Crawford. I run the restaurant across the street. You look like you could use a meal before whatever comes next. The girl's face crumpled with relief. I told him I wasn't pretty. In my letter, I don't know if he'll still want me when he sees me. Sarah's heart broke and mended simultaneously. Come with me. At Sarah's table, she sat the girl down, brought out fresh bread and stew. The girl ate like she hadn't in days. What's your name? Emma. Emma Hayes. I'm supposed to meet Mr. Patterson at 4 o'clock. Robert Patterson? Sarah smiled. He's a good man. Quiet, kind. Lost his wife 2 years ago. Emma's eyes filled. But what if he takes one look and what? Sees a scared girl who traveled 800 miles on faith. Sarah sat across from her. Let me tell you something, Emma. I arrived here 7 months ago, thinking exactly what you're thinking. She told her story. Not all of it, but enough. The fear, the shame, Thomas's patience, her own journey to believing she was enough. The man who's worth staying for, Sarah said, will see you. Really see you. Not just what you look like, but who you are. And if Mr. Patterson doesn't, then he's not your person. Emma wiped her eyes. How did you get so brave? Sarah laughed softly. I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being invisible. There's a difference. She walked Emma to the hotel, watched her straighten her shoulders before going inside, whispered a prayer for the scared girl she'd been. That evening, Thomas found Sarah on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and gold. He settled beside her, their comfortable silence speaking of how far they'd come. Do you ever regret Sarah started. That you're not beautiful, Thomas interrupted. But you are. She turned to him, ready to protest, but he pressed a finger to her lips. Somewhere between that first letter and now, you became the most beautiful woman I've ever known. I just had to learn how to see. Sarah's eyes filled. My whole life, people told me my only value was being useful. That if I couldn't be pretty, at least I could be helpful. And now, you taught me the difference between my gift and my value. She took his hand. My cooking is my gift. Something I give because I want to, not because I have to earn my place. But my value, that's just being Sarah. That's enough. Thomas pulled her close. My first wife deserved better than I gave her. I was so afraid of feeling anything that I felt nothing at all. Walked through my own life like a ghost. And now, you taught me that invisible doesn't mean not there. That the deepest things are often the quietest. He tilted her face toward his. I see you, Sarah May Crawford. All of you. Every stubborn, generous, beautiful piece. And I love all of it. The kiss was deeper than any before. Honest. Complete. Sarah finally believed she was treasured. Not despite being plain, but because she was herself, fully. When they pulled apart, stars were emerging overhead. The restaurant lights glowed in the distance, warm and welcoming. She'd whispered, I ain't pretty, sir, but I can cook, Thomas murmured against her hair. What she didn't know, Sarah continued, smiling, was that she'd feed his soul, not just his stomach. And in learning to see her, I finally learned to see myself. They sat in comfortable silence, Sarah's head on Thomas's shoulder, his arm around her waist. From the outside, they looked ordinary, middle-aged rancher and his plain wife on a weathered porch. But from inside, they were everything. Sarah closed her eyes, finally at peace, finally believing she was enough, finally home. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories look ordinary from the outside, but those who live them know the truth. They're the only stories worth telling.